and welcome to BookBeat, the place for all things literary. Today, we have as our guest Craig Reiners, author of Lingering Deception. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Sue Ellen.
I am very taken with this second book that you wrote. The first one was Justified Deception, and the second one is very interesting because the characters from Justified Deception come back. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me, Sue Ellen. This is very nice of you. I also want to, before I forget and address your question, recognize that the cover was done by a colleague of mine, Rick Bozak, and he did both covers, both Lingering Deception and Justified Deception. The book's about international markets, and by that I mean stock markets, bond markets, even agricultural markets in the background. Something happens and globally investors are panicking. In the background we have a serious monster preying on young women, and we bring back the character Alex Cutter, who's an independent IT specialist and security specialist, and he's tasked to unmask the what's happening in these markets, as well as address this terrible monster that is preying on women. So the overall book is still a crime thriller with kind of an international aspect to it. Lingering Deception really is, what I'm trying to do is entwine some smart, beautiful young women with conspiracy of market manipulation by some very savvy individuals, and then couple that with a very devious bad actor that protects his earthen tomb.
Okay, so that if that doesn't give you enough ammunition to get started finding this book, I don't know what will. You've already answered my second question. You gave us a peek. The thing that I found about the action of the book was that you went from one cliffhanger to the next. It was like a combination of bumper cars, tilt-a-whirl, and a roller coaster.
I think I should thank you for that, but yes, it's written in a way where one scene goes directly into another scene, and they're all coupled together, but they're particularly in the start of the book, they're very quick things that happen, and the reader has to ask herself, you know, how does this all fit? What's going on here? What are the common threads?
Okay, how do you hold on to that? How do you help the reader hold on to those various strands of the plot?
Right. What I really spent a lot of time on, Sue Ellen, was trying to develop a pace for the book, so that it was rapid enough to create a page turner, but also enough detail that the reader got some real depth to these characters and the scenes that are there. Also recognizing that a number of readers may have not read the first book, Justified Deception, but be that as it may, that I still would bring them in, so it was not necessary to read the first book as well. You know, bringing that all in together and how it fits obviously was somewhat challenging. I wanted to combine the physical action. There's a fair amount of physical action in the book, but there's also a lot of emotional trauma that takes place across the platform that I've got here. I think I talked quite a bit about strength of family in the book, but again, there's revenge, there's deception, there's greed, and there's lust in this book. So there's a lot of conflicting human emotions, and I've added some political intrigue just to top it off.
Did all the bad guys from Justified Deception get killed off?
Good question. No, some of them carried through. The real bad actor is now replaced by someone who's protecting an earthen tomb, and I'll just leave it at that. So there's a new bad actor. There's also some bad actors that were part of the international market manipulation piece. Those bad actors did carry forward, and again, in their mind's eye, they're not bad actors. They think they're just taking advantage of what's there in the marketplace because they're smarter than other people. Now, obviously they're committing fraud, but they don't see it that way. They see themselves as just smarter than the regulators and smarter than the markets that they're working. The other thing is, I wanted to spend more time in terms of bad actors on, what makes them bad actors. So in this book, Stanley Tibbett is the bad actor that the book is focused on. And there I try to give the reader a background on Stanley from when he was a young boy and being abused by a stepfather and a mother that protected him only to a certain degree. And then I go on to the abuse that he suffered both in junior high and high school, and even carried through when he was in the military service in the U.S. Army. So there's a reason for his evilness, but that being said,
Depravity.
right, he's not a good character because of that, but you at least recognize why he's as evil as he is.
How does the plot carry through from justified deception to lingering deception? What I mean is, you mentioned that the reader, if he or she has not read the first book, is able to pick up. How does that plot come through? Is there a timeline? What's the gap of time?
Right. In Justified Deception, the first novel, the real exceptionally bad actors are taken care of one way or the other. Some of the bad actors roll forward, and certainly the three protagonists, Alex Cutter, his wife Sparrow, and their daughter Alexia, are the three good actors that roll forward. And actually everything is going pretty well in their lives until some external circumstances force them back into this international intrigue.
Mm-hmm. I felt the characters really were fleshed out in Lingering Deception, but they do have their flaws. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Can you talk about the depth of the characters?
Yeah, well, thanks.
A little bit more.
Yeah, what I intended to do, hopefully was somewhat successful on it, is make this as real as possible. So even the strong lead characters have some flaws, and I did that by design. There's one character that on rare occasion drinks too much alcohol and has a problem with that. There are other characters that do some things that maybe aren't entirely lawful, but are pressed into service because of extraordinary circumstances. So there's an issue of making these characters very real. I actually want every so often for the reader to wince when they see some of the decisions some of these main characters make. They are the heroes and heroines, but they're not perfect. They're really somewhat flawed human beings that are on the right side of things, but they're not perfect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Two of the main characters are women. How do you, as a male writer, manage to get it right?
Well, first of all, thank you for thinking I got it right. What takes probably the most time is dialogue. And because I think I can get the time and place pretty well the first time around. But when you have the inner workings of what someone's thinking and feeling, that takes a lot longer. And what I've done is I've engaged a number of people. My wife, Mary, reads every chapter and diagnoses it and gives me critique. Obviously, Rick Bozak does as well. I've also got, fortunate enough to have two women in my neighborhood that actually are heads of their own book clubs, and they've taken an interest and they've given their own critique as I delivered different chapters to them. So I don't always get it right, particularly in the dialogue with the female characters. I'm looking for insights and so on, because you have to pause and think, well, under these circumstances, what are they feeling? What are they thinking? How would they react to these extraordinary circumstances I put them under? So it's probably one of the most enjoyable things I do to get it right, but it's very seldom the first thing that I get it right. But I really look for critique from these people, these outside people that I listen to.
Mm-hmm. So you're working on obviously rewriting things over and over again.
Over and over again, yeah.
How do you do your research?
On certain things, I just rely on my background. Relative commodity markets and equity markets and so on, I have a lot of experience on those sorts of things. Where I don't have experience on is anything on the medical field and so on. So I do a lot of research on anatomy and what would happen to the human body if such and such happened. I'm also not real savvy politically, so I'm always searching for more detail on that. A good example there is a character in the book called Mr. Zinn, and I try to, he's a minor character, but I kind of try to revisit what's happening from his perspective. He's a member of the Chinese Politburo. He's one of the 7 most powerful men in China, and arguably maybe in the world. And so what's important to him and how he looks at things is another perspective on this global collapse and market manipulation and so on. And he gives it a whole different spin than an investor would or an investigator would. And developing those minor characters to me is just a lot of fun and also very challenging.
And it gives the story depth. That's the thing that I liked,
Yeah.
is, as I said, fleshing out characters. You mentioned Mr. Zinn. Are there other minor characters
Yes, yeah, there are.
that would do some explanation or
Right.
some highlighting?
Actually, three of the characters are rollovers from the first book, Justified Deception. These are the market manipulators. Again, in their mind's eye, they're not doing anything wrong. They're just getting rich. They obviously are crooks. They're financial crooks. There's project a financial hardship on a lot of people by this market manipulation, which real quickly, that part of the book is very, very small. I don't want to lose people in a financial moray at all, but it's a small part of the book, but the characters are not a small part of the book. So there's a aristocratic German gentleman that resides in his own castle south of Munich,
yeah.
which is a very interesting character to develop. Then there's a German oligarch that is, a Russian oligarch that lives in St. Petersburg, Russia, that is moving on his way up the food chain, if you will, in Russia. And then they collaborate with a gentleman that is overweight. He's doesn't fit into the typical bad actor per se, but he's a real numbers guy, very brilliant numbers guy. They collaborate with him. He lives in Cape Town, South Africa. So you've got this global aspect of these 3 market manipulators doing things for different reasons, and Alex Cutter and his team trying to figure that out while they're still trying to wrestle with this monster that's capturing, torturing, and killing women. So there's 2 plot lines that kind of come together later in the book.
Okay. I think we talked a little bit about bridging the gap between the 2 books. Are there any other suggestions that you have for how a reader could approach this reading Lingering Deception first?
Yeah. First off, I would hope they read the other one first, but be that as it may, that's not always the case. I would look at, as I wrote this second book, I kept that always in mind and kept, what I use a lot of times is a very brief flashback. So the parties that we're talking about would flash back and remember something from the first book, if you will, so that they would get a sense. But there's a fine line there too, because you don't want to recapture all that from the first book. You want just enough so they understand characters fit together and how they fit in the strata of these various characters you have. But I was fully aware of that when I wrote that a lot of people might just pick this one up and not the first book. And so I think whether they're major characters or minor characters, I always took that into account, that maybe that no one's heard of Mr. Zinn before, or the German aristocrat before, and so I give them just enough. Sometimes it's a short paragraph just to add some background to who those characters are, why they're important, why they fit in. But I also don't try to copy what I've done in the first book. So a good example, when one of the leaders of the Politburo was mentioned, again, Mr. Zinn, we talked about him earlier, I try to add another dimension to Mr. Zinn from the Chinese Politburo that wasn't mentioned in the first book.
Okay.
So that gives him a little more depth, and also maybe seeing himself from his point of view. So he is sitting in the precipice of power. Things are happening. He's the financial wizard of China and globally, their investments, and something is radically happening. He has to address it. So what's going on in his mind? What are the important things to him, rather not the reader, but to the character? And so I try to, whether they're good characters or bad actors, I try to give a little bit from their perspective, so the reader gets a sense. They still might find some of the characters despicable, but they realize there's a reason for them to be despicable.
Okay. The other thing that I found, and if you would comment on it, how do you get that idea of what happened in the first book into the second book without giving away everything?
Yeah, right.
In Justified Deception.
Right, that's a good point, yeah.
And can you talk to that?
Yeah, when I crawl back into these characters to give the new reader, a perspective of who these people are, I do it just from their character, and not from really actions they've taken in the first book, but just who they are. Here's a Russian oligarch that's on his rise up. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. What I've tried to do there is, in every case, as I bring a character forward, I'm assuming that people have not read the first book, but I don't give them the same detail that I did in the first book. I give them a different sense of detail. So a good example is one of these bad actors that happens to sit on the Chinese Politburo. I describe his role and so on in China in the first book. So in the second one, I give a little more depth in terms of who he is as a person, how he views the chairman of the Communist Party, how he views what his motivations are. Because he's 72 years old, very powerful individual. What's important to him from his perspective? So I kind of give another level of depth to the character, and still reminding the reader that this is a character that did roll over from the first tale, and they're important for these reasons. But I do that just to that extent. I don't give anything away for the first book.
Let's take a turn. We've been talking about the book Lingering Deception pretty much. Let's take a turn. You mentioned briefly of your background in finance. Could you talk a little bit more about how you came to all of this subject matter? The pundits say, write what you know. How did you find out all of this stuff?
The genesis of all this started when I was working in Asia. This is in the mid-1990s. By law, I had to have a joint venture partner with the Communist Party. We owned, of this large manufacturing unit in Nanjing, China, we owned 99% of the equity of that company. 1% was bought in, if you will, by the Chinese government. And so I had a member of the Chinese government sit on our board. And he was kind of the equivalent of a governor of a state in the U.S., so he's a very powerful political figure. And to be part of a large joint venture, Western style, was a big boost from him career-wise. It was a big deal for him. And he would act as if he owned the company. He would act like he owned the company. So it was interesting to understand those dynamics, and you had to kind of stroke his ego, but at the same time you still had to run the company the way your investors expected you to. So there was a fine balance there with my joint venture partner.
It sounds like it was kind of the tail wagging the dog.
Yes, yeah, very much so, very much so. And then having the background that many years in China, I spent a lot of time in Japan, in Malaysia, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, in all those areas. So I'm kind of trying to draw some of those travel experiences and business experiences into the book without overdoing it. So I think people get a sense of time and place by having that direct experience. And again, all the books I'm writing are all fiction, so I'm not taking any one person and bringing them into the book, but I do take different aspects of people I've met over those years and kind of embellish those and make those very interesting characters. There's a little sliver of somebody in every character.
Okay. I touched on it before, but what's the time difference? Sparrow was quite a young woman
Yes.
in Justified Deception. She and Alex have this daughter, and that is their daughter. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's correct, yep.
So it's 20-some years, is it?
No, it's about 15 years.
About 15?
About 15 years difference, because she was about 16, 17 at the end of the first book. So
Okay, I am confused. Tell me a little bit about the time frame between Justified Deception and Lingering Deception.
When we finished the first book and that first tale, Alex's business is doing very well. Business is growing exponentially, which is an information technology business and a physical security business globally. He and his wife have almost semi-retired. Their daughter, Alexia, is now married and has one small child. So about 15, 16 years have transpired between the books. So you've got Alex and Sparrow, obviously older, not retired, but maybe a little semi-retired. Business is doing very well.
So late 50s
Yes.
for him?
Yes, late
And-
50s for him.
And early 50s for her?
Correct.
Is that about right?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. That helps
Yeah.
set the stage for how this transpires.
Right.
A little more, I'd like to talk about how your writing process, not just what your writing process is, but how does that contribute to getting these characters on paper? Do they live with you? Do you have flashes of what they should be, or is it just journeyman?
Oh, that's a great question. I can answer it this way. The lead characters in the book personally lived with for over 10 years. And for me personally, they are as real as you and I. I mean, they're very real people. As I bring in new characters to the storyline, they're not as real to me, but I want to make them as real to the reader as I possibly can. That's why in the second book, Lingering Deception, I've tried to give the reader a little more depth to each character, even if they're a minor character, a little more depth to who they are, what their background, why they're important to the story, so there's a sense when they take an action or say something or move the plot along, it makes sense.
Okay.
I think they, bringing that together is really important.
Mm-hmm. So they live with you, but how do you, on a daily basis, when you sit down and work, are you sitting down and working on the actual plot or the actual place, or are you spending a lot of time rewriting? What's the kind of balance on that?
It's a great question. First off, I try to keep it as a real discipline. I mean, I work on it easily 6 to 7 hours every day, 6 days a week. I mean, it's kind of a job for me, and a passion maybe is a better way of putting it. So I have that discipline. I always, and I'll write down different ideas, maybe that aren't linear. I'll take a character and in my mind say, well, where they are in the story, what could contribute to something interesting in the future, and just think about that for a while. I'll actually think about or try to be in a character for a period of time and see where he or she would be in the timeline and what's going on in their minds. And it has nothing to do linear with the story, and I'll just write some notes down, maybe a paragraph or two, and then see if it fits later on. But you're right, there's a lot, and I mean a lot of rewriting. None of that's sexy, none of that's interesting, none of that makes you feel good at the end of the day, but it's really necessary. A lot of rewriting. And there are times, I'll go off to write and I have nothing. I have nothing new. So it's a little embarrassing, but I mean, then I'll just rewrite and check things and check timelines, and that's the pick and shovel type of work that goes into it. Not very sexy, not very interesting, but sometimes you have to do that. There are other times when you have some real inspiration. It could happen at 11 o'clock at night or something. When you have some real inspiration, you just go with it, because you've been thinking about these characters for a while, and something clicks because he or she might look at the situation in a unique way, and you say, you know what, let's go with that. And just write. And when I do that, I'm not trying to make it perfect the first time. It's almost more ideas and real rough draft, and then come back maybe the next morning and take a look at it and clean it up and see if it works. I think the other tough thing to do, at least for me, because I'm a new writer, is when you have something that initially you thought was pretty good, and it's not, either you think it's not, or the people that you respect and you're having them do some, you have to throw it away sometimes. That's pretty difficult to say, you know what, I was going down that road, it wasn't so good, so let's throw that in the trash can. That's one of the most difficult things to do.
Okay, so you throw some things in the trash can. Do you really throw them away, or do you put them on the back burner someplace so that if they come up?
Okay, you caught me on that. I do. I don't literally throw them away. In fact, some of them could be used for the third book. So yeah, I do. Yes, you caught me. I do park those because some of them are pretty interesting ideas, whether it's character development or a plot twist, or something that where you change the timeline. Or another one is, I think a lot of readers like this short flashback. As long as it flows with the book. And some of those flashbacks are things I'll pick up from later.
Okay.
That's good. You caught me.
Good. I gotcha. How do you keep track of that many characters, that variety of times, the flashbacks? What physically do you do to contain it? That's
a great question. I do not have that in my mind. I actually have a big flow sheet that is in pencil, and I move things around. This person does this to this in this character. We've eliminated this person. We're bringing this person back in. Basically, a large piece of paper in pencil that I'm moving things around, blocks. And what I try to do, I hope I'm doing this, when I'm moving major pieces around, I don't want to confuse the reader. That's not the intent. I want it to be realistic. So let's say you have two characters in a untenable situation. It's just hard to imagine how they're going to get out of that situation. I have to think what realistically could happen. And sometimes that takes a long time. But if you come up with it, then the reader is first surprised, but they're not turned off by, well, that would never happen. So it's got to be plausible, and it's got to be in sync with those characters. But that's why the characters, particularly Sparrow and Alexia, are such major characters because of their not only their intellectual curiosity, but they're smart women that figure things out. Even though they're put in untenable situations, they eventually figure it out and move on.
Okay. I think, what kind of advice do you have to aspiring writers?
Well, Sue Ellen, a couple things come to mind. One, write a little bit about what you know. The backdrop of the story is financial manipulation. I don't dwell on it, but there's a backdrop of that going on in a very global sense. So first of all, write what you know, I think, or what you think you know. Secondly, fully recognize when you first put it on the PC or in writing, it's not going to be right the first time. It never is. And you've got to have the stick-to-itiveness to recognize that you're not going to have that. But the other thing I'd say, when you have some inspiration or some idea, just go with it. Even if it doesn't immediately fit your plot or something, just go with it. It might fit in later, or it might give you other ideas. So don't squelch an idea. Just kind of go with it. The other thing I like to do is how to start a chapter. I spend a lot of time on what the first sentence is of every single chapter. So it doesn't absolutely have to flow from page 39 to page 40, but it grabs the reader like, wait a sec, where's this going now, and forces them to come in. So I like to do that. But back to your original question is don't get discouraged. In my case, whether it's embarrassing or not, it took 10 years to write the first book. It took 7 months to write Lingering Deception. It takes a while, and you're never going to get it right the first time.
Right. That's true with 99% of the people spend their time with perspiration rather than inspiration.
Well, you had talked earlier about Rick Bozak, the artist
Yes.
that I met. It's an interesting story because, as I mentioned, Rick did both covers. He had actually been in my wedding, and we had disconnected. I was working around the world at the time, but be that as it may, we reconnected after 40 years, not even communicated. But now I see him once a week.
How did you find him?
I was, after the first book, I thought, you know, you can't tell a book by its cover, but a cover is awfully important. I have no artistic talent at all, zero artistic talent. And I started to think, well, who do I know that you know is an artist or would have interest in this? And my wife, Mary, actually mentioned. He said, well, wasn't Rick a graphic designer, a graphic artist? I said, yeah. So I had to search to find out where Rick was. He happened to live in White Bear Lake, of all places.
Oh my goodness.
So we reconnected. He loved the books. Actually, he thinks they could be made into movies, which is kind of fun to even think about. He took a great interest in it. He was very drawn to the books. He worked on both covers, just did an outstanding job. He drew people in without telling the story. I think you don't want to tell the whole story in the cover, but you want to make them interesting enough that people will at least open it up and see if they're interested.
And a picture is worth 1,000
It
words.
really is, yeah. And I thought he did an outstanding job. I have nothing but praise for Rick Bozak for the work he's done on this. And the other thing, Sue Ellen, he took it very seriously. This was not just a lark for him. He worked at this. I think created a good finished product.
Is there another book in the pipeline?
Thanks for asking. There is. I'm thinking of a title of Cascading Lies. I'm not sure that will stick, but I'm right about 12,500 words right now. It's a continuing story, continuing saga of this family, what they're going through, and I fully intend to wrap everything up. This will be the last of these particular characters. But they're such interesting characters, and they finished with resolving a lot of the major issues in Lingering Deception, but there are some lingering things happening, and I thought it would be interesting as these characters get older and things change in their lives. How does that make for a finishing story that's still compelling and interesting for people? Because although a lot of things are wrapped up in Lingering Deception, at the very end there's a few open issues, we'll call them, that could be entanglements for the next book. So I've had a lot of fun drafting that up, but I fully intend to bring all the open issues to closure there, and that's been a lot of fun.
Did you intend to do a trilogy?
I yes and no. I thought it would be kind of cool to do that, but I didn't know where this was going. For example, when I wrote the first book, I did not have any outline or conception for the second book. So it kind of naturally flowed rather than it was by design. Probably should have said it was by design, it wasn't. But I do have in my mind's eye kind of a wrap up for this trilogy, if you will. Because I hope the characters are engaging enough that the readers, have some ownership in each of them, and want to know what happens, and that's I hope that there's kind of a connection or almost a love for these two women, and who again are somewhat flawed, but are still the lead characters, put in extraordinary circumstances, and as they age, which they do, how does that all come together in some sort of realistic but package that still draws the reader in, because hopefully I'm taking them on a journey that's not their normal day-to-day.
Right, and it's a meaningful journey.
Yes.
That's the thing that I'm taken with Lingering Deception, is that the action is very meaningful to the individuals, and it propels them kind of into the next adventure.
Right.
And
I appreciate that.
the thing that I noticed is the women are inventive. They're kind of female MacGyvers.
Well, they're smart, huh?
They're very, very bright,
very bright.
very inventive, and it's their wits that keep them alive.
Absolutely, yeah. They're just smart women that work well together. They kind of complement each other. They're again put in extraordinary circumstances, and they realistically figure a way to get out of them. But I think they're characters that the reader will, come to love, right? And as I said earlier, they're not perfect. They're very good. They're close to perfect, but they also have their own human flaws to them as well. Mm-hmm. So that there's a sense of realism for these characters. They don't do everything right. Maybe they do 95% of things right, but they do a few things that
are questionable.
Are questionable. Thank you.
Yes, that's what I noticed. Yeah. I won't give it away, but there's one particular thing that I think the readers will enjoy, and they'll kind of say, "Oh, really?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah. That's what they did.
Yeah.
And
I know what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. And so we're going to leave that for the reader to find out.
Perfect.
We're getting to the end of our time. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
Talk briefly about writing style and so on, and I don't want to repeat that, but I would encourage people that have interest in writing to, first of all, just do it. You got to start somewhere, and you just do it. Write a little. The base of what you write, I think, should be what you know, and start with that, and then just try it. It's incredibly exhilarating when you get it right. Like I said earlier, you don't get it right all the time, but when the dialogue works, when the storyline clicks together, particularly when it's can be somewhat complex, when it all makes sense, that's a real. It's a sense of accomplishment that I think young writers would love. I didn't start writing till I was, I guess I was 55 years old, and I was doing all this travel. So now that I'm retired, I write, like I said, writing every day. But I think maybe another idea, even if you have a full-time job and you have a passion for this or interest, start. Just start, right?
Do something.
Do something, and it doesn't have to be a thriller or a novel or a series. It can be a short story. It can be something to get you started and get your creative juices going and your blood flowing. But and then test it with some people, not just with your peer group, but with third parties that aren't friends or relatives that you respect and get their feedback. And then the last thing I'd say is take feedback. You don't know the truth. You don't know everything that's perfect. So when you get feedback from both male and female readers, and get feedback from young and older readers. Get feedback from a broad array of people. Listen to all of it. Doesn't mean you have to take it, but listen to all that feedback. And maybe the last thing would be, do it your way. Create your own style. Don't try to mimic my style or someone else's style. Make your own style.
Tell me a little bit about the relationship of the international trading piece and the whole story. Right. Where do those two things fit in?
The manipulation of stock markets, bond markets, and agricultural markets done on a global scale is very much a backdrop to the story. It's what initially draws Alex Cutter and his team in to help solve, not only for the U.S. market, but for the Chinese market, for the European markets, and so on. He's a third party that's brought in to kind of find out what happens and bring some corrective action to that. But it's a backdrop of the story, because that's what starts things off, and then other things happen that are much more to the forefront, are much more personalized, if you will.
For me, who is not a financial geek, I will understand what's in the story.
Yes, I wrote and rewrote that section many times to really bring it, not only bring it to life, but make it understandable and interesting, because it's really about manipulation. I use markets as an example, but manipulation is manipulation.
That's right.
However you define it. Really, the market segment, you don't have to be a stock trader or a commodity trader to understand this. This is really for everybody, using the markets just as a backdrop to the overall story.
Okay. Craig Reiners, thank you so much for joining us at Book Beat today.
Thank you for having me, Sue Ellen.
The book is Lingering Deception. Our guest has been Craig Reiners. We thank you for joining us at Book Beat, the show for all things literary. Please join us next time. Hello and welcome back to Book Beat. I'm your host, Sue Ellen Zagrabelny. We're here this afternoon at the Hennepin County Library, Maple Grove, with two of the library staff, Libby Whittier and Lori Steeg. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are about thrillers and suspense novels today. Could you describe the difference among thrillers, mysteries, suspense novels, any others that you can think fit in the general category? Who'd like to start?
Well, I'll start. The mystery genre is a fiction that usually involves a detective or someone trying to solve a crime, and there's usually a mysterious death, and they spend the bulk of the book trying to figure out who did it. And that differs from thrillers because the detective novels, usually the crime is first, but then in the thriller, it usually is revealed at the very end.
Okay. And do you have something, Laura, to add to that?
Thrillers are defined by moods that they inspire. You have a sense of excitement, surprise.
Okay. I think that answers my question. The next thing that I'm interested in is, are they different from adventure novels?
They are. An adventure novel usually happens within the out of doors, where someone is dealing with the elements, or they've had some kind of accident and they're trying to survive in that environment.
Okay.
Whether it's a blizzard or a hurricane or something that is outside of the ordinary existence of their everyday life.
Okay. Do suspense novels and thrillers have anything to do with science fiction?
Yes,
Okay.
as a matter of fact, I'm going to talk about one.
Okay. Well, why don't you talk about that right now?
Okay. This is James Patterson, The Dolls. It's one of his book shots that he writes. If you're interested in reading something that's only 150 pages long, and maybe because you've got a busy schedule and you don't have time to read, this is the way to go. This particular one is based on a reporter who is working in the cities. She just got a new job, and basically the main story is the dolls are robots. They're sex dolls is what they are, and they're going out to kill their bosses, basically. Anyway, I don't want to tell you anymore. I'm going to ruin it.
Okay. Yes. You don't want to blow the plot for the person.
You got
Okay. So let me see if I can recap. Mysteries usually involve a detective and a mysterious death, right?
Right.
So far, so good?
Yes.
Adventure novels tend to involve the out of doors, right? Okay, so far so good. Then the thrillers and suspense novels, tell me again what the difference is. Do you use these terms interchangeably? Or are there some differences between a thriller and a suspense novel?
Well, your suspense novel unfolds with twists and turns. It also has your surprises. It keeps you in suspense. You may have, there could be a romance background in there, going, something that's unique. Go ahead, Libby.
Well, thrillers are, as you're reading along, you're finding surprises and anticipation. As Lori said earlier, it's the moods that are inspired by the book. And at the end, you almost have a sense of sigh of relief that, oh, they made it. In whatever it is, sometimes it will be taking place in other countries where it's espionage involved. And suspense, there are some crossovers because there can be that sort of mood also inspired by suspense. But suspense oftentimes will involve murders as well along the way.
So there's a fair amount of crossover, I'm
There-
hearing you say.
Yes.
There is.
Okay. How large a collection of thriller suspense novels does the Maple Grove Library have?
Well, they have about 3,500 thrillers, as classified as such, and 2,600 romantic suspense.
Okay.
So quite a large collection.
Yes. So let's back up to the romance aspect a little bit. So off camera, my camera person was saying that some of these she recognized that she found as romance novels. So romantic suspense is kind of that can be a crossover in itself.
Right. If it's a romantic suspense, there's a romance that takes place, and oftentimes that's with the main character that's trying to help a damsel in distress, per se, and solve things that are happening in her life, or the other way around. It could be that there is a romance that comes with, oftentimes the character is on the run from something that's one or the other of them is going to be potentially murdered.
Okay. That makes sense. Do you have anything to add, Lori?
The only thing I would say is that half the stuff that I put up on display, a lot of it is just the way you said. It's the crossover from your mystery suspense. It's got the romance to it. You may have your, say your partner in a police station. You might have two people. Those two people are in a romantic relationship and so forth.
So it's a suspense or it's a thriller, but there's also that aspect
Yes.
of romance.
If there's kissing involved in the book, it becomes a romantic suspense.
Okay, that's a good distinction. What formats can people find at the Maple Grove Library with thrillers, suspense novels, mysteries, and so forth?
We have quite a large collection of regular book form, but then we also have audiobook and ebooks, and of course some of the books have been made into movies, but
So there are movies available for checking out too.
there
as well.
are indeed.
Hardcover, softcover, print books, e-books, audiobooks, and the movies.
And also large print. I
Li-
forgot
oh.
to mention that there are large print, we have quite an extensive large print collection as well.
That is very helpful. As people have more difficulty reading, it's
Right.
good that they don't have to stop reading because of that disability. What about the earliest novels, suspense novels and thrillers? Do either of you have any information about them?
I do.
Go for it.
Yeah.
And you do too, so let's hear about both of those.
Wilkie Collins, his novel Woman in White, it was published in 1860. And then Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes books between 1887 and 1927. Of course, there was Edgar Allan Poe, and his books crossed over between horror, and a lot of times there is crossover between horror and suspense and thriller. And he wrote The Telltale Heart in 1843. And then often described as the queen of mysteries, we had Agatha Christie, and she published her first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, in 1920. And then Dashiell Hammett who's also quite a well-known mystery writer,
Mm-hmm.
strictly mystery. He wrote detective novel Maltese Falcon in 1929, and we mentioned a lot of the a lot of the books became movies.
Yes.
And of course, the Maltese Falcon with Humphrey Bogart was quite well known.
Classic.
Classic.
Yes. What about you, Lori? What do you have to add to that?
The only one I've got is Daphne du Maurier wrote Rebecca in 1938.
And it was made into a wonderful
A
movie.
wonderful
Yes.
movie, and a remake that's just come out recently.
Now that I have not seen. Well, that's wonderful.
Not the same.
Not the same.
No.
The remakes just don't do it for
No.
me, for the most part. I would rather see the classics. Can you give some examples of some suspense or thriller novels that are very current? Lori, why don't you start?
Ruth Ware, The Lying Game. Lee Child's Night School. What we have out here is some of our new stuff also. Dan Brown's The Origin. John Grisham, The Rooster Bar. He also did Cameo Island, and The Whistler is also one of his new ones, this one right there.
Okay.
It's a
Okay.
Rizzoli and Isles novel. Want to take some?
Thank you, Lori. And I might mention that all of the books that we have been talking about on this list of current fiction are from 2017 publications. So they are definitely the most recent of the authors that we are talking about.
Wow. That's quite a collection of what's available here at the Maple Grove Library. Can you say something about, if you don't have a particular title, how a user could get those novels?
If we don't have a particular title in the library, and a lot of times there is a waiting list for a lot of these titles, you can, if you don't have a library card, you can get a library card, and then we can reserve the title of the item or book that you want to read.
And whether you get it, is it also true that you get on the list and it might come from another library? Is that true?
Yes.
So I think what's important for viewers to know is that when you come into the library, you can look on the card catalog, the electronic card catalog, and see where books are available, and you can request a book. And if Maple Grove Libraries, for instance, can't find the title on their shelf, they can order it from another library if it's available. So that's a really important feature and a very important service that the Hennepin County Libraries offer.
Now I might add that if the 41 libraries through Hennepin County Library, if we can't find it in one of the 41 libraries, we can also go through MinLink, which is also interlibrary loan. And then we can find it through the whole state of Minnesota.
Oh my goodness, that's really good. Did you have something else to add?
Well, I was going to say that if you were interested in not necessarily a particular title, but in just romantic suspense, that you could isolate it that way, or maybe you just wanted to know what books Iris Johansen has. You can search through the title as well, or the author as well.
So those are good techniques to use in using the card catalog.
Right.
And it's not your mother's card catalog anymore.
No.
It is all electronic and automated, and the search engine is second to none. I'd like to end up by talking about Justified Deception. I'd like to end up by talking about Justified Deception, the book that was featured at the beginning of the show by CR Reiners. This book, like the one you described by Iris Johansen, had a cast of characters that just went on and on and on. The interesting thing was the names of some of them changed in the middle because they had aliases. and that took place in very exotic sites. And so I found with that book and the books that you're describing, that it made me think that you may be able to read them for escape, but there's something compelling about being asked to figure things out in your head. And so that's one of the reasons why I'd like to recommend to our readers and viewers that they look at these genre and find some things to read. Keep reading. That's my point of view. I usually ask at the end of each interview, is there anything else you'd like to add that I haven't discussed or haven't asked you? Let's start with Libby first.
Well, I would like to encourage as well that people do read and come to the library and explore what we have in our collection, because it really has a little bit of something for everyone. We have children's books and of course adult books and all of them within that genre. There's equally as many suspense for children in our collection, and not as intense a level as the adult, but
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there are young adult and teen novels.
teen novels as well. Books do go back into the past and delve into the past, and then they're solving a mystery that's happening in the present that is affected, perhaps something their parents did or something their grandparents did, where it's brought up to the current day, and they're figuring out the mystery of what is affecting them now.
I see. How about you, Lori?
Libby said it best.
Be sure to watch BookBeat for all things literary. We look forward to seeing you soon.